President's Dream Colloquium on the topic of civil disobedience in the context of climate change and a dysfunctional democracy. I'm going to give a little more local context to this series in a couple of minutes, but before I do that, I would like to invite up to the stage a new and already very cherished friend, Audrey Siegel, who is going to welcome us onto these lands that we're occupying. Audrey.
That's a lot of people. Mitsep Platquilam Atanash with Mathguimash Tamoch Tana Whale. I Quinish Quellowens Quincy Kutsnala. Sklemtanok Onisquich Tanitsanat Humathguiam. Why Huikden eats Lena August Kthanasit Lash. This is the language of my ancestors. We've spoken this language since the first sunrise, as long as we've been here. It's called Hunkaminam. It's the language of a couple different areas, including Musqueam, that's the land we're on right now. Translates into welcome to the traditional unceded land of the Musqueam people. It gives me feelings of great joy inside to be here with you today. My name is Chemtanot, and I am from Musqueam, and I feel so proud every time I get to say that. And I am the granddaughter of the late Stephen and Selena August. And apropos of the topic for today, we can say this anywhere in the world. It is sacred, this Indian land, and the rights that go along with it for the Indigenous people and everybody else who settled onto it are important. And we need to be united. We need to be indivisible. We need to be focused and have honest, accurate information about what is going on and what is being hidden from us. Because there is so much that is being hidden. Our rights have been stripped away from us systematically for a couple of decades, and a lot of people are asleep at the wheel about it. But tonight, here, in this group of, I'm told, 1,200 people, I don't think there's a single, I think everyone here is wide awake. And it makes me proud to stand here with you, to stand in a church, to speak my language, to do an acknowledgement of whose land this still is, in the most humble and respectful way, because it means a lot. It means a lot to have a respect for my culture. It means a lot for me to feel welcome and invited to be here, because this is a sign of the changes that are coming. And there is an important change that is happening now. And that change has to do with waking up. That change has to do with people empowering themselves. That change has to do with people uniting. We have a phrase, "Nutsamat tishqualowinst." We are of one heart and one mind, and at every event that I go to, it's happening more and more. We are becoming one. We are becoming united. And as I said earlier, that makes us indivisible. We are unstoppable, and we have no option but to be successful in our goals of protection in order to maintain a future, but as well as to respect the past of these lands as well. So on that note, I say Haitsapka to each of you for taking your time and with your energy and with your presence to show what is important. Because a lot of people believe we cannot make a change, and they just willing to lie down and die and accept the status quo. And we're all here to say, hell no, I will not lie down, I will not die. So in our important and often hard and dangerous and even more often fun work to completely decimate that status quo for everybody's benefit, we stand together to do that. And in that we can say, Stamachsen, I am a warrior, because everybody here tonight, you are a warrior. You are using You're using your voices and your presence today to say that, and to have somebody like Chris Hedges and Stephen and everybody else who's here to kind of set the tone of how we move forward. We're really lucky and blessed. So to finish the welcome, there's a song that goes with it, and it just jumped right out of my head. Okay, I remember. It is It's a Musqueam paddle song. It's a song of honor and respect. It's sung to welcome people, but it was an actual paddle song for rowing the canoes. And with this song, I welcome our ancestors in. I welcome the change. I welcome the energy. I invite them to come and be with us, to empower us, to help us see what we need to see, and to help our hands and our eyes and everything to do the good work that we're meant to be here to do. So again, Heitsapka.
Waichka, Audrey. Thank you. Thank you also, Audrey, for setting the tone and grounding us all in the sacred significance of the important topics that we have to talk about tonight. I'm just going to give about a 3 or 4 minute context, the local context for the series. Steve and I started planning this series about 2 years ago. We were both concerned that our society was losing touch with the significance and the importance and the respectable role of civil disobedience in a democracy. And we were also concerned that we saw accelerating dissent and more frequent civil disobedience in the context of both our provincial and our federal governments pushing ahead with fossil fuel infrastructure projects against the will of many of us. So in response to that, we began planning this series, but little did we know how very much in the middle of it we would land before the series began. So as many of you may know, last fall, Stephen and I were named in a lawsuit by Kinder Morgan for protesting. We were sitting peacefully in a public park on Burnaby Mountain, and the two of us like to write, and we were publishing articles that said that we were willing to do civil disobedience. So for publicly publishing those words that we were willing to do civil disobedience, not that we had done it, we were sued by Kinder Morgan. So I was shocked. We were all shocked. We were really shocked. That could happen in Canada. And I think everyone in the room is probably aware of Bill C-51, the so-called anti-terrorist bill that is before the House now. And many of you may also know of the recent RCMP report that was leaked to the media. And in that report, the RCMP is reporting to the Government of Canada their concern that these protesters are more and more frequently crossing the line from peaceful protest into direct action such as civil disobedience. Elizabeth May has repeatedly asked Stephen Harper in the House, are people who do civil disobedience terrorists? He won't answer her. So this is a pretty chilling situation, and this is basically our local environment, and we have to think now, where do we go from here? And there's lots of different directions. We need protest on every front. And now it's my pleasure to introduce you to my friend and colleague with whom I organized this series, Stephen Collis.
Thanks, Dan. Good job. I think maybe, am I live here? You can hear me? Yeah. Oh, good. Hopefully it wasn't while I was down there whispering and things like that. I don't think so. So it's wonderful to be here with you on these marvelously unceded lands. A couple really quick shout outs, all the SFU, Public Square people, everyone in the Dean of Grad Studies office, everyone that worked very hard on organizing this evening, all the volunteers that are working, Paperhound bookstore, a wonderful independent small Vancouver bookshop that is selling Chris's books somewhere out there. I'm not quite sure if it's in there. They're amazing. If you don't know Paperhound on Pender Street, you should get there sometime and check them out. Yeah, Paperhound. Oh, and I was going to do a shout out too to the Graduate Liberal Studies program at SFU, who are also focused on marvelous public events like this and in bringing people, adults, back into the education system to start changing the world with us. All right. All resistance must recognize that the corporate coup d'etat is complete. We must not waste our energy trying to reform or appeal to systems of power. This does not mean the end of resistance, but it does mean very different forms of resistance. So writes Chris Hedges, near the end of The Death of the Liberal Class. Hedges is never one to beat around the bush or sugarcoat his analysis, and this is one of his real values as a thinker. We don't go to Hedges to be uplifted or for glimmers of inextinguishable hope. We can't even use the word hope, Hedges has said, until we begin to confront reality. The confrontation with contemporary socio-political reality. Irreversible climate change driven forward by a willfully self-destructive, greedy, and self-deluded fossil fuel industry. A political system completely corrupted and dominated by the wealthiest and most powerful individuals and corporations. A media servant of those same individuals and corporations, interested only in diversion and furthering our most cherished illusions of freedom and democracy. This is Hedges' terrain. Quote, "The mania for hope is a kind of sickness because it prevents us from seeing how dire and catastrophic the situation is if we don't radically reconfigure our relationship to each other and to the ecosystem." End quote. So if not hope, what then? Stephen Jenkinson, kind of a palliative care guru, says hope prevents us from adequately grieving for what we have lost. And I do think we have some serious grieving to do. But we also don't have a lot of time. Recently, speaking on a panel on Naomi Klein's book, This Changes Everything, I picked up on Audrey Siegel's suggestion, her suggestive connection between women's bodies and the land. The Alberta tar sands, I said, is a murdered and missing landscape. Every day, we are creating more such landscapes. Is hope even something to look for in this situation? Hedges, following Augustine, recommends hope's two beautiful daughters, anger and courage. And this is where Hedges actually offers a kind of hope, the hope of our potential social rage, our potentially undyingly resistant hearts, the still stokable fire of moral outrage, the way we can sometimes actually feel solidarity burning deep in our bellies. Here's Hedges, once again near the end of the death of the liberal class. Quote, "The media, the arts, scholarship, and political and social movements must become conduits for unvarnished moral outrage and passion." End quote. Maybe what Hedges has to offer us in his many books, his tireless public lectures and media appearances, isn't so much hope as it is a call of and for moral outrage, a call to resistance, a call to follow hope's more interesting and potent daughters, anger and courage. The call to resistance, English philosopher Howard Cahill notes, performs a capacity to resist, which, once declared, is actualized. To listen to Chris Hedges is to hear that call and to actualize it in our listening. It's a pleasure to introduce him this evening. Please join me in welcoming Chris to these unceded territories. Thanks a lot, Chris.
Thank you very much. I have two connections to Canada, one of them to Vancouver. My wife, of course, is Canadian, and my daughter's at UBC, although she's doing a year abroad in France. So she was spared being dragged to hear me speak. I think many of us who care about climate change look to you as the front line, the gravity, not only for Canada, but finally for the planet, of not shutting down the tar sands, of not stopping the Kinder Morgan Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion and the Enbridge Northern Gateway is truly catastrophic. And we have to come up here and join you. But the only thing left that we have as a tool to halt the death of the ecosystem and finally the extinction of the human species are our bodies. The most prescient portrait of the American and Western character and our ultimate fate as a species is found in Herman Melville's Moby Dick. Melville makes our murderous obsessions, our hubris, violent impulses, moral weakness, and inevitable self-destruction visible in his chronicle of a whaling voyage. And he is our foremost oracle. He is to us what William Shakespeare was to Elizabethan England, or Fyodor Dostoevsky to Tsarist Russia. In Melville's novel, the United States is given shape in the form of the ship, the Pequod, named after the Indian tribe exterminated in 1638 by the Puritans and their Native American allies. The ship's 30-man crew, there were 30 states in the Union when Melville wrote the novel, is a mixture of races and creeds. The object of the hunt is a massive white whale, Moby Dick, which in a previous encounter maimed the ship's captain Ahab by dismembering one of his legs. The self-destructive fury of the quest, much like that of the one we are on, assures the Pequod's destruction. And those on the ship, on some level, know they are doomed. Just as many of us know that a consumer culture based on corporate profit, limitless exploitation, and the continued extraction of fossil fuels is doomed. If I had been downright honest with myself, Ishmael admits, I would have seen very plainly in my heart that I did but half fancy being committed this way to so long a voyage, without once laying my eyes on the man who was to be the absolute dictator of it, so soon as the ship sailed out upon the open sea. But when a man suspects any wrong, it sometimes happens that if he be already involved in the matter, he insensibly strives to cover up his suspicions even from himself. And much this way it was with me. I said nothing and tried to think nothing. We are fast approaching a world where the richest 1% of the world's population will have amassed more than half of the planet's wealth. The bottom 80% will be left with 5.5% of the wealth. Our financial system, like our participatory democracy, is a mirage. The Federal Reserve in Washington purchases $65 billion in U.S. Treasury bonds, much of it worthless subprime mortgages, each month. It has been artificially propping up the government and Wall Street like this for over 5 years. It has loaned trillions of dollars at virtually no interest to banks and firms that make money, because wages are kept low, by lending it to us at staggering interest rates that can climb to 30%. Or our corporate oligarchs hoard the money or gamble with it in an overinflated stock market. Estimates put the looting by banks and investment firms of the U.S. Treasury at between $15 and $20 trillion. But none of us know. The figures are not public. And the reason this systematic looting will continue until collapse is that our economy would go into a tailspin without this giddy infusion of cash. The ecosystem is at the same time disintegrating. Scientists from the International Program on the State of the Ocean warn that the oceans are changing faster than anticipated and increasingly becoming inhospitable to life. The oceans, of course, have absorbed much of the excess CO2 and heat from the atmosphere. This absorption is rapidly warming and acidifying the seas. This is compounded, the report noted, by increased levels of deoxygenation from nutrient runoffs from farming and climate change. The scientists call these effects a deadly trio that, when combined, is creating changes in the seas that are unprecedented in the planet's history. This is their language, not mine. The scientists wrote that each of the Earth's 5 known mass extinctions was preceded by at least one part of the deadly trio: acidification, warming, and deoxygenation. They warn that the next mass extinction of sea life is already underway, the first in some 55 million years. Or look at the recent research from the University of Hawaii that says global warming is now inevitable, it cannot be stopped, at best it can be slowed. That over the next 50 years, the Earth will heat up to levels that will make parts of the planet uninhabitable. Tens of millions of people will be displaced, and millions of species will be threatened with extinction. The report cast doubt that cities on or near coasts, such as New York or London, will endure. Yet we, like Ahab and his crew, rationalize our collective madness. All calls for prudence, for halting the march toward economic, political, and environmental catastrophe, for sane limits on carbon emissions are ignored or ridiculed. Even with the flashing red lights before us, the increased droughts, rapid melting of glaciers and Arctic ice, monster tornadoes, vast hurricanes, crop failures, floods, raging wildfires, and soaring temperatures, we bow slavishly before hedonism and greed and the enticing illusion of limitless power, intelligence, and prowess. The corporate assault on culture, journalism, education, the arts, and critical thinking has left those who speak this truth marginalized and ignored. Frantic Cassandras who are viewed as slightly unhinged and depressingly apocalyptic. We are consumed by this mania of hope, which our corporate masters lavishly provide at the expense of truth. Friedrich Nietzsche in Beyond Good and Evil holds that only a few people have the fortitude to look in times of distress into what he calls the molten pit of human reality. Most studiously ignore the pit. Artists and philosophers for Nietzsche are consumed, however, by an insatiable curiosity, a quest for truth, a desire for meaning. They venture down into the bowels of the molten pit. They get as close as they can before the flames and heat drive them back. This intellectual and moral honesty, Nietzsche wrote, comes with a cost. Those singed by the fire of reality become burnt children, he wrote, eternal orphans in empires of illusion. Decayed civilizations always make war on independent intellectual inquiry, art, and culture for this reason. They do not want the masses to look into the pit. They condemn and vilify the burnt people. They feed the human addiction for illusion, happiness, and hope. They peddle the fantasy of eternal material progress. They urge us to build images of ourselves to worship. They insist, and this is the argument of globalization, that our voyage is, after all, decreed by natural law. And we have surrendered our lives to corporate forces that ultimately serve systems of death. We ignore and belittle the cries of the burnt people. And if we do not swiftly and radically reconfigure our relationship to each other, as well as to the ecosystem, microbes look set to inherit the earth. Clive Hamilton, in his Requiem for a Species While We Resist the Truth About Climate Change, describes a dark relief that comes from accepting that catastrophic climate change is virtually certain. This obliteration of false hopes, he says, requires an intellectual knowledge and an emotional knowledge. The first is attainable. The second, because it means that those we love, including our children, are almost certainly doomed to insecurity, misery, and suffering within a few decades, if not a few years, is much harder to acquire. To emotionally accept impending disaster, to attain the gut-level understanding that the power elite will not respond rationally to the devastation of the ecosystem, is as difficult to accept as our own mortality. And the most daunting existential struggle of our time is to ingest this awful truth intellectually and emotionally and rise up to resist the forces that are destroying us. The human species, led by white Europeans and Euro-Americans, has been on a 500-year-long planet-wide rampage of conquering, plundering, looting, exploiting, and polluting the earth, as well as killing the indigenous communities that stood in the way. But the game is up. The technical and scientific forces that created a life of unparalleled luxury, as well as unrivaled military and economic power for a small global elite, are the forces that now doom us. The mania for ceaseless economic expansion and exploitation has become a curse, a death sentence. But even as our economic and environmental systems unravel, with 14 of the last 15 years of the 21st century, the hottest on record, with 200 with 2014 being the hottest since record-keeping began. We lack the emotional and intellectual creativity to shut down the engine of global capitalism. We have bound ourselves to a doomsday machine that grinds forward. Complex civilizations have a bad habit of ultimately destroying themselves. Anthropologists, such as Joseph Tainter in The Collapse of Complex Societies, Charles Redman in Human Impact on Ancient Environments, and Ronald Wright in A Short History of Progress, have laid out the familiar patterns that lead to systems breakdown. The difference this time is that when we go down, the whole planet goes with us. There will, with this final collapse, be no new lands left to exploit, no new civilizations to conquer, no new peoples to subjugate. The long struggle between the human species and the earth will conclude with the remnants of the human species learning a painful lesson about unrestrained greed, hubris, and idolatry. Collapse comes throughout human history to complex societies not long after they reach their period of greatest magnificence and prosperity. One of the most pathetic aspects of human history is that every civilization expresses itself most pretentiously, compounds its partial and universal values most convincingly, and claims immortality for its finite existence at the very moment when the decay which leads to death has already begun, Reinhold Niebuhr wrote. That pattern holds good for a lot of societies, among them the ancient Maya, the Sumerians, of what is now southern Iraq. And there are many other examples, including small-scale societies such as Easter Island. The very things that cause societies to prosper in the short run, especially new ways to exploit the environment, such as the invention of irrigation, lead to disaster in the long run because of unforeseen complications. And this is what Ronald Wright in A Short History of Progress calls the progress trap. We have set in motion an industrial machine of such complexity and such dependence on expansion, Wright notes, that we do not know how to make do with less or move to a steady state in terms of our demands on nature. And as the collapse becomes palpable, if human history is any guide, we, like past societies in distress, will retreat into what anthropologists call crisis cults. The powerlessness we will feel in the face of ecological and economic chaos will unleash further collective delusions, such as fundamentalist beliefs in a god or gods who will come back to earth and save us. The Christian right provides a haven for this escapism. These cults perform absurd rituals to make it all go away, giving rise to a religiosity that peddles collective self-delusion and magical thinking. Crisis cults spread rapidly among Native American societies in the latter part of the 19th century as the buffalo herds and the last remaining tribes were slaughtered. The ghost dance held out the hope that all the horrors of white civilization, the railroads, the murderous cavalry units, the timber merchants, the mine speculators, the hated tribal agencies, the barbed wire, the machine guns, even the white man himself would disappear. And our psychological hardwiring is no different. In our decline, hatred becomes our primary lust, our highest form of patriotism. We deploy vast resources to hunt down jihadists and terrorists, real and phantom. We destroy our civil society in the name of a war on terror. We persecute those from Julian Assange to Chelsea Manning to Edward Snowden who expose the dark machinations of power. We believe because we have externalized evil that we can purify the earth, and we are blind to the evil within us. Melville's description of Ahab is a description of the bankers, corporate boards, politicians, television personalities, and generals who, through the power of propaganda, fill our heads with the seductive images of glory and lust for wealth and power. We are consumed with self-induced obsessions that spur us towards self-annihilation. All my means are sane, Ahab says. My motive and my object mad. Ahab, as the historian Richard Slotkin points out in his book Regeneration Through Violence, is the true American hero, worthy to be captain of a ship whose wood could only be American. Melville offers us a vision, one that D.H. Lawrence later understood, of the inevitable fatality of white civilization that brought about by our ceaseless lust for material progress, imperial expansion, white supremacy, and the exploitation of nature. Melville, who had been a sailor on clipper ships and whalers, was keenly aware that the wealth of industrialized society was stolen by force from the wretched of the earth. All the authority figures on the ship are white men: Ahab, Starbuck, Flask, and Stubb. The hard, dirty work, from harpooning to gutting the carcasses of the whales, is the task of the poor, mostly people of color. Melville saw how European plundering of indigenous cultures from the 16th to the 19th centuries, coupled with the use of African American slaves as a workforce to replace the natives, was the engine that enriched Europe and the United States. The Spaniards' easy seizure of the Aztec and Inca gold following the massive die-off from smallpox and other diseases among native populations, set in motion 5 centuries of unchecked economic and environmental plunder. And Karl Marx and Adam Smith each pointed to the huge influx of wealth from the Americas as having made possible the Industrial Revolution and modern capitalism. The Industrial Revolution also equipped the industrialized states with technologically advanced weapon systems, turning us into the most efficient killers on the planet. Ahab, when he first appears on the quarterdeck, after being in his cabin for the first few days of the voyage, holds up a doubloon, an extravagant gold coin, and promises it to the crew member who first spots the white whale. He knows that the permanent constitutional condition of the manufactured man is sordidness, and he plays to this sordidness. The whale becomes, like everything in a capitalist world, a commodity, a source of personal profit. A murderous greed, one that Starbuck, Ahab's first mate, denounces as blasphemous, grips the crew. Ahab's obsession infects the ship. I see in Moby Dick outrageous strength, with an inscrutable malice sinewing it, Ahab tells Starbuck. That inscrutable thing is chiefly what I hate. And be the white whale agent or the white whale principal, I will wreak that hate upon him. Talk not to me of blasphemy, man. I'd strike the sun if it insulted me. Ahab conducts a dark mass, a Eucharist of blood and violence on the deck with the crew. He orders the men to circle around him. He makes them drink from a flagon that is passed from man to man, filled with draughts hot as Satan's hoof. Ahab tells the harpooners to cross their lances before him. The captain grasps the harpoons and anoints the ship's harpooners, Queequeg, Tashtego, and Dago, his 3 pagan kinsmen. He orders them to detach the iron sections of their harpoons and fill the sockets with the fiery waters from the pewter. Drink, ye harpooners, drink and swear, ye men that man the deathful whaleboat's bow. Death to Moby Dick. God hunt us all if we do not hunt Moby Dick to his death. And with the crew bonded to him in his infernal quest, he knows that Starbuck is helpless amid the general hurricane. Starbuck now is mine, Ahab says, cannot oppose me now without rebellion. The honest eye of Starbuck, Melville wrote, fell downward. The ship, described as a hearse, was painted black. It was adorned with the gruesome trophies of the hunt, festooned with the huge teeth and bones of sperm whales. It was, Melville writes, a cannibal of a craft, tricking herself forth in the chaste bones of her enemies. The fires used to melt the whale blubber at night turned the Pequod into a red hell. And our own raging fires, leaping up from the tar stands, from oil refineries, from the explosions of our ordnance across the Middle East, bespeak our Stygian heart. In our mad pursuit, we ignore the suffering of others, just as Ahab does when he refuses to help the captain of a passing ship who is frantically searching for his son who has fallen overboard. Ahab has not only the heated rhetoric of persuasion, he is master of a terrifying internal security force on the ship, the 5 dusky phantoms that seem fresh formed out of air. Ahab's secret, private whaleboat crew, who emerge from the bowels of the ship well into the voyage, keeps the rest of the ship in abject submission. The art of propaganda and the use of brutal coercion, the mark of tyranny, define our lives as they mark those on Melville's ship. The novel is the chronicle of the last days of a civilization. And yet, Ahab is no simple tyrant. Melville, toward the end of the novel, gives us 2 glimpses into the internal battle between Ahab's maniacal hubris and his humanity. Ahab, too, has a yearning for love. He harbors regrets over his deformed life. The black cabin boy, Pip, is the only crew member who evokes any tenderness in the captain, and Ahab is aware of this tenderness. He fears its power. Pip functions as the fool did in Shakespeare's King Lear. Ahab warns Pip of Ahab. Lad, lad, says Ahab, I tell thee thou must not follow Ahab now. The hour is coming when Ahab would not scare thee from him, yet would not have thee by him. There is that in thee, poor lad, which I feel too curing to my malady. Like cures like, and for this hunt my malady becomes my most desired health. If thou speakest thus to me much more, Ahab's purpose keels up in him. I tell thee, no, it cannot be. A few pages later, untottering Ahab stood forth in the clearness of the morn, lifting his splintered helmet of a brow to the fair girl's forehead of heaven. From beneath his slouched hat, Ahab dropped a tear into the sea. Nor did all the Pacific contain such wealth as that one wee drop. Starbuck approaches him. Ahab, for the only time in the book, is vulnerable. He speaks to Starbuck of his 40 years on a pitiless sea, the desolation of solitude it has been. Why this strife of the chase? Why weary and palsy the arm at the oar and the iron and the lance? How the richer or better is Ahab now? He thinks of his young wife. I widowed that poor girl when I married her, Starbuck. And of his little boy. About this time, yes, it is his noon nap now. The boy vivaciously wakes, sits up in bed, and his mother tells him of me, of cannibal old me, how I am abroad upon the deep, but will yet come back to dance with him again. Ahab's thirst for dominance, vengeance, and destruction, however, overpowers these faint regrets of lost love and thwarted compassion. Hatred wins. What is it, Ahab finally asks? What nameless, inscrutable, unearthly thing is it? What cozening, hidden lord and master and cruel, remorseless emperor commands me that against all my natural lovings and longings I so keep pushing and crowding and jamming myself on all the time. Melville knew that physical courage and moral courage are distinct. One can be brave on a whaling ship or a battlefield, yet a coward when called on to stand up to human evil. Starbuck elucidates this peculiar division. The first mate is tormented by his complicity in what he foresees as Ahab's impious end. Starbuck, while generally abiding firm in the conflict with seas or winds or whales, or any of the ordinary irrational horrors of the world, yet cannot withstand those more terrific because spiritual terrors, which sometimes menace you from the concentrating brow of an enraged and mighty man. And so we plunge forward in our doomed quest to master the forces that will finally smite us. Those who see where we are going to often lack the fortitude to rebel. Mutiny was the only salvation for the Pequod's crew, and it is our only salvation. But moral cowardice turns us into hostages. I am reading and rereading the debates among some of the great radical thinkers of the 19th and 20th centuries about the mechanisms of social change. These debates were not academic. They were frantic searches for the triggers of revolt. Lenin placed his faith in a violent uprising, a professional, disciplined, revolutionary vanguard freed from moral constraints, and like Marx, in the inevitable emergence of the worker state. Pierre-Joseph Proudhon insisted that gradual change would be accomplished as enlightened workers took over production and educated and converted the rest of the proletariat. Mikhail Bakunin predicted the catastrophic breakdown of the capitalist order, something we are likely to witness in our lifetimes, and new autonomous worker federations rising up out of the chaos. Peter Kropotkin, like Proudhon, believed in an evolutionary process that would hammer out the new society. And Emma Goldman, along with Kropotkin, came to be very wary of both the efficacy of violence and the revolutionary potential of the masses. The mass, Goldman wrote bitterly toward the end of her life, echoing Marx, clings to its masters, loves the whip, and is the first to cry, "Crucify." The revolutionists of history counted on a mobilized base of enlightened industrial workers. The building blocks of revolt, they believed, relied on the tool of the general strike, the ability of workers to cripple the mechanisms of production. Strikes could be sustained with the support of political parties, strike funds, and union halls. Workers without these support mechanisms had to replicate the infrastructure of parties and unions if they wanted to put prolonged pressure on the bosses and the state. But now, with the decimation of the U.S. and Canadian manufacturing base, along with the dismantling of our unions and opposition parties, we will have to search for different instruments of rebellion. We must develop a revolutionary theory that is not reliant on the industrial or agrarian muscle of workers. Most manufacturing jobs have disappeared, and of those that remain, few are unionized. Our family farms have been destroyed by agribusinesses. Monsanto and its Faustian counterparts on Wall Street rule, and they are steadily poisoning our lives and rendering us powerless. The corporate leviathan, which is global, is freed from the constraints of a single nation, state, or government. Corporations are beyond regulation, beyond control. Politicians are too anemic, or more often too corrupt, to stand in the way of the accelerating corporate destruction. This makes our struggle different from revolutionary struggles in industrial societies in the past. Our revolt will look more like what erupted in the less industrialized Slavic republics, Russia, Spain, and China, and uprisings led by a disenfranchised rural and urban working class and peasantry in the liberation movements that swept through Africa and Latin America. The dispossessed working poor, along with unemployed college students and graduates, unemployed journalists, artists, lawyers, teachers, and indigenous communities, will form our movement. This is why the fight to raise the minimum wage is crucial to uniting service workers with the alienated, college-educated sons and daughters of the old middle class. Bakunin, unlike Marx, considered day class A intellectuals essential for successful revolt. In the end, it is not the poor who make revolutions. It is those who conclude that they will not be able, as they once expected, to rise economically and socially. This consciousness is part of the self-knowledge of service workers, fast food workers, and other low-wage workers. It is grasped by the swelling population of college graduates, caught increasingly in a vice of low-paying jobs and rising debt. These two groups, once united, will be our primary engines of revolt. Much of the urban poor has been crippled and in many cases broken by a rewriting of laws, especially drug laws in the United States, that has permitted courts, probation officers, parole boards, and police to randomly seize poor people of color without just cause and lock them in cages for years. In many of our most impoverished urban centers, what Malcolm X called our internal colonies, mobilization, at least at first, will be difficult. The urban poor are largely in chains, and these chains are being readied for the rest of us. The law, in its majestic equality, forbids rich and poor alike to sleep under bridges, beg in the streets, or steal bread, Anatole France commented acidly. Erica Chenoweth and Maria Stephan examined 100 years of violent and nonviolent resistant movements in their book, Why Civil Resistance Works. They concluded that nonviolent movements succeed twice as often as violent uprisings. Violent movements work primarily in civil wars or in ending foreign occupations. Nonviolent movements that succeed appeal to those within the power structure, especially the police and civil servants, who are cognizant of the corruption and decadence of the power elite and are willing to abandon them. And we need only 1% to 5% of the population actively working for the overthrow of a system, history has shown, to bring down even the most ruthless totalitarian structures. It always works on two tracks: building alternative structures, such as public banks, to free ourselves from control, and finding mechanisms to halt the machine. But the most important dilemma facing us is not ideological, it is logistical. The security and surveillance state has made its highest priority the breaking of any infrastructure that might spark widespread revolt. The state knows the tinder is there. It knows that the continued unraveling of the economy and the effects of climate change make popular unrest inevitable. It knows that as underemployment and unemployment doom larger and larger segments of the population to perpetual poverty, as benefits are scaled back, as schools close, as the middle class withers away, as pension funds are looted by hedge funds, and as the government continues to let the fossil fuel industry ravage the planet, the future will increasingly be one of open conflict. This battle against the corporate state right now is primarily about infrastructure. We need an infrastructure to build revolt, and the corporate state is determined to deny us one. The state and its internal projections has a vision of the future that is as dystopian as mine. But the state, to protect itself, lies. Politicians, corporations, the public relations industry, the entertainment industry, and our ridiculous television pundits, Kevin O'Leary, speak as if we continue to build a society based on limitless growth, profligate consumption, and fossil fuel. They feed the collective mania for hope at the expense of truth. Their public vision is self-delusional, a form of collective psychosis. But the corporate state, internally, is preparing for a world it knows is actually coming. It is cementing into place a police state, one that includes the complete evisceration of our most basic civil liberties and the militarization of the internal security apparatus, as well as the wholesale surveillance of all citizens. Moby Dick rams and sinks the Pequod. The waves swallow up Ahab and all who followed him except one. A vortex formed by the ship's descent collapses, and the great shroud of the sea rolled on as it rolled 5,000 years ago. As the planet begins to convulse with fury, as the senseless greed of limitless capitalist expansion implodes the global economy, as our civil liberties are eviscerated in the name of national security, shackling us to an interconnected security and surveillance apparatus that stretches from Moscow to Istanbul to New York. How shall we endure? How shall we resist? Our hope lies in the human imagination. It was the human imagination that permitted African Americans during slavery and the Jim Crow era to transcend their physical condition. It was the human imagination that sustained Sitting Bull and Black Elk as their land was seized and their cultures were broken. And it was the human imagination that allowed the survivors in the Nazi death camps to retain the power of the sacred. It is the human imagination that makes possible transcendence, chants, work songs, spirituals, the blues, poetry, dance, and art, converged under slavery to nourish and sustain this imagination. These were the forces that, as Ralph Ellison wrote, we had in place of freedom. Now, the oppressed would be the first, for they know their fate, to admit that on a rational level such a notion is absurd. But they also know that it is only through the human imagination that they can survive. Jewish inmates in Auschwitz reportedly put God on trial for the Holocaust and then condemned God to death. A rabbi stood after the verdict to lead everyone in evening prayers. African Americans, Native Americans, indigenous communities for centuries had little control over their destinies. Forces of bigotry and violence kept them subjugated by whites. Suffering for the oppressed was tangible. Death was a constant companion. And it was only their imagination, as William Faulkner noted at the end of The Sound and the Fury, that permitted them, unlike the novel's white Compson family, to endure. The theologian James Cone captures this in his book, The Cross and the Lynching Tree. Cone says that for oppressed blacks, the cross was a paradoxical religious symbol because it inverts the world's value system with the news that hope comes by way of defeat, that suffering and death do not have the last word, that the last shall be first and the first last. Cone continues that God could make a way out of no way in Jesus' cross was truly absurd to the intellect, yet profoundly real in the souls of black folk. Enslaved blacks who first heard the gospel message seized on the power of the cross. Christ crucified manifested God's loving and liberating presence in the contradictions of black life. That transcendent presence in the lives of black Christians that empowered them to believe that ultimately, in God's eschatological future, they would not be defeated by the troubles of this world, no matter how great and painful their suffering. Believing this paradox, this absurd claim of faith, was only possible in humility and repentance. There was no place for the proud and the mighty, for people who think that God called them to rule over others. The cross was God's critique of power, white power, with powerless love, snatching victory out of defeat. Reinhold Niebuhr labeled this capacity to defy the forces of oppression as a sublime madness in the soul. Niebuhr wrote that nothing but madness will do battle with malignant power and spiritual wickedness in high places. This sublime madness, as Niebuhr understood, is dangerous, but it is vital. Without it, truth is obscured. And Niebuhr also knew that traditional liberalism was a useless force in moments of extremity. Liberalism, Niebuhr said, lacks the spirit of enthusiasm, not to say fanaticism, which is so necessary to move the world out of its beaten tracks. It is too intellectual and too little emotional to be an effective force in history. The prophets in the Hebrew Bible had this sublime madness. The words of the Hebrew prophets, as Abraham Heschel wrote, were a scream in the night. While the world is at ease and asleep, the prophet feels the blast from heaven. The prophet, because he or she saw and faced an unpleasant reality, was, as Heschel wrote, compelled to proclaim the very opposite of what his or her heart expected. Primo Levi, in his memoir, Survival in Auschwitz, tells of teaching Italian to another inmate, Jean Samuel, in exchange for lessons in French. Levi recites to Samuel from memory Canto 26 of Dante's The Inferno. It is the story of Ulysses' final voyage. We cheered, but soon that cheering turned to woe. For then a whirlwind born from the strange land battered our little vessel on the prow. 3 times the boat and all the sea were whirled, and at the 4th, to please another's will, the aft tipped in the air. The prow went down until the ocean closed above our bones. He has received the message, Levi wrote of his friend and what they shared in Dante. He has felt that it has to do with him, that it has to do with all who toil, and with us in particular. Levi goes on. It is vitally necessary and urgent that he listen, that he understand, before it is too late. Tomorrow, he or I might be dead, or we might never see each other again. The poet Leon Staff wrote from inside the Warsaw Ghetto, even more than bread, we now need poetry, in a time when it seems that it is not needed at all. It is only those who harness their imagination and through their imagination find the courage to peer into the molten pit who can minister to the suffering of those around us. It is only they who can find the physical and psychological strength to resist. Resistance is not carried out for its success. It is carried out because by resisting, we find we affirm life. And those who resist in the years ahead will be those who are infected with a sublime madness. As Hannah Arendt wrote in The Origins of Totalitarianism, the only morally reliable people are not those who say, this is wrong, or this should not be done, but those who say, I can't. They know that, as Immanuel Kant wrote, if justice perishes, human life on earth has lost its meaning. And this means that, like Socrates, we must come to a place where it is better to suffer wrong than to do wrong. We must at once see and act. And given what it means to see, this will require the surmounting of despair, not by reason, but by faith. One of the only coherent philosophical positions is revolt, Camus wrote, It is a constant confrontation between man and his obscurity. It is not aspiration, for it is devoid of hope. That revolt is the certainty of a crushing fate, without the resignation that ought to accompany it. The people noticed that Crazy Horse was queerer than ever, Black Elk said, in remembering the final days of the wars of Western expansion. He went on to say of the great Sioux warrior, he hardly ever stayed in the camp. People would find him out alone in the cold, and they would ask him to come home with them. He would not come, but sometimes he would tell the people what to do. People wondered if he had ate anything at all. Once my father found him out alone like that, and he said to my father, "Uncle, you have noticed me the way I act, but do not worry. There are caves and holes for me to live in, and out here the spirits may help me. I am making plans for the good of my people." Homer, Dante, Beethoven, Melville, Dostoevsky, Proust, Joyce, Auden, Dickinson, James Baldwin, along with artists such as the sculptor David Smith or the photographer Diane Arbus or the blues musician Charlie Patton, all had it. It is the sublime madness that lets one sing, as bluesman Ishman Bracey did in Hines, Mississippi. "I've been down so long, Lord, down, don't worry me." And yet, in the midst of his imagination also lie the absurdity and certainty of divine justice. I feel my hell arisen every day. I feel my hell arisen every day. Someday it'll burst this levee and wash the whole wide world away. Shakespeare's greatest heroes and heroines, Prospero, Antony, Juliet, Rosalind, Hamlet, Cordelia, Lear, all have this sublime madness. King Lear, who through suffering and affliction, through human imagination, is finally able to see, warns us that the unbridled human passion and unchecked hubris means the suicide of the species. It will come, Albany says in Lear. Humanity must perforce prey on itself like monsters of the deep. It was the poems of Federico Garcia Lorca that sustained the Republicans fighting the fascists in Spain. Music, dance, drama, art, song, painting have been the fire and drive of resistant movements. The rebel units in El Salvador, when I covered the war, always traveled with musicians and theater troops. Art, as Emma Goldman pointed out, has the power to make ideas felt. And Goldman noted that when Andrew Undershaft, a character in George Bernard Shaw's play Martyr Barbara, said poverty is the worst of crimes and all the other crimes are virtues beside it, his impassioned declaration elucidated the cruelty of class warfare more effectively than Shaw's socialist tracts. The degradation of education into vocational training for the corporate state, the ending of state subsidies for the arts and journalism, the hijacking of these disciplines by corporate sponsors, sever the population from understanding, self-actualization, and transcendence. In aesthetic terms, the corporate state seeks to crush beauty, truth, and imagination. And this is the war waged by all totalitarian systems. Culture, real culture, is radical and transformative. It is capable of expressing what lies deep within us. It gives words to our reality. It makes us feel as well as see. It allows us to empathize with those who are different or oppressed, and it reveals what is happening around us. It honors mystery. The role of the artist then precisely is to illuminate that darkness, blaze roads through the vast forest, James Baldwin wrote, so that we will not, in all our doing, lose sight of its purpose, which is, after all, to make the world a more humane dwelling place. Ultimately, the artist and the revolutionary function as they function and pay whatever dues they must pay behind it, because they are both possessed by a vision And they do not so much follow this vision as find themselves driven by it, Baldwin wrote. Otherwise, they could never endure, much less embrace the lives they are compelled to lead. I do not know if we can build a better society. I do not even know if we will survive as a species. But I know these corporate forces have us by the throat, and they have my children by the throat. I do not fight fascists because I will win. I fight fascists because they are fascists. And this is a fight which, in the face of the overwhelming forces against us, requires us to embrace this sublime madness, to find in acts of rebellion the embers of life, an intrinsic meaning that lies outside of certain success. It is to at once grasp reality and then refuse to allow this reality to paralyze us. It is, and I say this to people of all creeds and no creeds, to make an absurd leap of faith, to believe, despite all the empirical evidence around us, that the good always draws to it the good, that the fight for life goes somewhere, we do not know where. The Buddhists call it karma. And in these acts, we sustain our belief in a better world, even if we cannot see one emerging around us. The Turkish poet Nazim Hikmet, who spent most of his adult life in prison or in exile, knew something of despair. But he knew something, too, of resistance, of that rebellious spirit which must define us in times of terrible oppression and woe, if we are to remain fully human. Any act of resistance is its own eternal triumph. Hikmet captured this in his poem, On Living. Living is no laughing matter. You must live with great seriousness. Like a squirrel, for example, I mean without looking for something beyond and above living. I mean living must be your whole occupation. Living is no laughing matter. You must take it seriously, so much so and to such a degree that, for example, your hands tied behind your back to the wall, or else in a laboratory in your white coat and safety glasses, you can die for people, even for people whose faces you've never seen, even though you know living is the most real, the most beautiful thing. I mean, you must take living so seriously that even at 70, for example, you'll plant olive trees, and not for your children either, but because although you fear death, you don't believe it, because living, I mean, weighs heavier. Let's say we're seriously ill, need surgery, which is to say we might not get up from the white table. Even though it's impossible not to feel sad about going a little too soon, we'll still laugh at the jokes being told. We'll look out the window to see if it's raining, or still wait anxiously for the latest newscast. Let's say we're at the front for something worth fighting for, say. There, in the first offensive on that very day, we might fall on our face, dead. We'll know this with a curious anger, but we'll still worry ourselves to death about the outcome of the war, which could last years. Let's say we're in prison and close to 50, and we have 18 more years, say, before the iron doors will open. We'll still live with the outside, with its people and animals, struggle and wind. I mean with the outside beyond the walls. I mean however and wherever we are, we must live. as if we will never die. The earth will grow cold, a star among stars, and one of the smallest, a gilded mote on blue velvet. I mean this, our great earth. The earth will grow cold one day, not like a block of ice or a dead cloud even, but like an empty walnut. It will roll along in pitch black space. You must grieve for this right now. You have to feel this sorrow now. For the world must be loved this much if you're going to say, I lived. Thank you.
So we're just going to present Chris with a little gift for coming out here and talking to us tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Very cool. Thank you.
And we have time for some questions. So we have about half an hour. There should be 4 microphones out in the room. So if you would like to ask a question, put your hand in the air. The microphone will come to you. And I'm going to give you just a couple of quick tips. One is please be as brief as you can. It's not an opportunity to give us your own theory or your own life story. Ideally, you're going to make a very brief comment or question, and then we'll take that mic back and Chris will respond. You don't get one. Great.
Chris, to answer the question that I gave you,
Pardon me?
I gave you a written sheet with my questions. Could you please give it to Chris?
You did.
Thank you.
I will read one of your questions. We know very well that Washington is owned stock, lock, and barrel by the Wall Street Mafia. Washington, corrupt to the core, exists to do Wall Street's bidding, while the Wall Street kleptocratic oligarchy, very good, is sucking life out of America like a giant vampire squid. It was Benito Mussolini who gave name to the corporate takeover of the state, fascism. The question is, how do we see the end game to the existing situation? Will it be a third world war as outlined in the fourth turning? Well, we're going to do the one question.
Well, that's the quote from Matt Taibbi's great book, Griftopia, on Goldman Sachs. Revolutionary movements throughout history come in waves. And I fall down on my knees every night and hope that it started in Greece. Because from Greece, it will spread to Spain, 25% unemployment, Portugal, Italy. And I hope that contagion, that realization that I think most of the Greek population has grasped that the system doesn't work on our behalf, will be one that we will be able to replicate. The economy in the United States is far worse than in Canada. I mean, we now have half of all American citizens living in a state of either poverty or near poverty. We don't have the social safety net that you have in Canada. The other thing about American culture, unlike Canadian culture, is that it's we are a deeply violent society. And I'm hoping that consciousness and the Occupy movement really had its origins in the Indignados in Spain and what happened in Europe will have a kind of ripple effect both in the United States and in Canada. And I think we have to do everything we can in our power to further that radical movement and dismantle the systems. And with this new terrorism law, I think it's Harper's third terrorism law, it's as bad as anything we have in the United States. And in the United States, we've, of course, utterly eradicated any kind of privacy. One of the things that we saw in the Occupy movement, I don't know if this has happened in Canada, but because people communicated electronically, in the aftermath, the state knew precisely who were the engines of the movement, and they have repeatedly been hauled into court and given felony charges, they make them plea out usually, but that you plea out with a 5-year probation, which means you can't do any activism for 5 years, or you'll have to serve a 7-year sentence. They've been busting into apartments, stealing laptops, and they're getting the right people. They know who to get. And so just as we saw with you and Steve, something as innocuous as, because they're frightened, they're terrified. Internally, they know how gamed and corrupt the system is. And they have seen all of the scenarios that have been run out in the United States by the National Security Council and everything else on the effects of climate change. I mean, they know very, very well what's coming down the pike, and we have to wrest power from them, while we still have a chance.
Yeah.
This is a question from Twitter. Chris, can you please detail for the audience tonight what kinds of actions we need to support and engage in to rise up?
Everything from personal choices, which is why I became a vegan. The animal agriculture industry is one of the engines of the destruction of the climate. So that's a very personal choice. Building sustainable communities. The more that you can remove yourself from the wider consumer culture, the more you have the capacity to resist. And we have to begin to pull people into the streets in large numbers. And actually Canada's been pretty good at this, both with First Nations peoples, with the student movement in Quebec, because it has to be sustained resistance. That's all we have left, is putting our bodies in the street. That's it. And there isn't much time. So I think in terms of making personal choices, those are some. Local farmers markets and all of this is important. And building a community that gives you enough energy and support in order to carry out resistance. I don't like going to jail. It's more time than I care to donate to the U.S. government. But I don't think we have any choice left.
I can't see, so I'm hoping someone has a microphone right now and is going to ask a question. I can't see out there.
Hello. I have a question because I think the problem is, or how do we get people to revolt or to resist if we can't see any suffering yet? It is not in front of our eyes, the suffering. So that's my question.
How do we get people to revolt or resist? I covered the revolutions in Eastern Europe, in East Germany, in Czechoslovakia, Romania. I covered both of the Palestinian uprisings or intifadas. I covered the street demonstrations that eventually brought down Milosevic. And that trigger, what it is, remember Lenin, 6 weeks before the Russian Revolution, got up and said to all the other Bolsheviks they'd never see revolutionary change in their lifetime. Even those people who are closest to, even the purported leaders of resistance movements, don't know when rebellion takes place. So I was in Leipzig on November 9th, 1989, with the leaders of the East German opposition that afternoon, and they said to me, maybe within a year, there'll be free passage back and forth across the Berlin Wall. By that evening, the Berlin Wall as an impediment to human traffic did not exist. And I think Havel is a very important figure, Václav Havel. Charter 77, his great essay, which I urge you all to read, The Power of the Powerless, where he talks about living in truth. And acts of resistance, which many in this room have carried out, oftentimes when they are carried out, appear to be futile, ignored by the wider society, and yet they trigger not only a consciousness, but they keep alive a narrative or flame. So when I was in Prague during the Velvet Revolution, I was every night in the Magic Lantern Theater with Havel, Klaus, and Dinsbier. All through the streets of the city were posters of a young Charles University student named Jan Palach, who, to protest the Soviet invasion in 1968, had gone to Wenceslas Square, lit himself on fire, and 4 days later he died of his burns. When university students marched in his funeral procession, the police broke it up. Of course, it was a non-event. It was never reported by the state media. When his grave became a shrine, the communist authorities exhumed his body, cremated them, gave the ashes to his mother, and said that he wasn't allowed to be reburied. And 2 weeks after the communist government fell, 10,000 people gathered in Red Army Square and renamed it Jan Palach Square. I was also in Wenceslas Square when the great Czech singer Marta Kubasheva came out on the balcony. She had sung a prayer for Marta, which was the anthem of defiance that was broadcast over the airwaves when the Soviet tanks rolled in to overthrow Dubček. And the pro-Soviet regime that replaced Dubček destroyed her recording stock, banned her from the airwaves. Remember, this is 1968. And she had spent the intervening years working on an assembly line in a toy factory. I was there that night, snowing, with 500,000 people. And I watched her, this is 1989, walk out on that balcony and begin to sing the prayer for Marta. And every Czech in that crowd knew every word. Acts of resistance have a moral force that can never be measured when they are carried out. But finally, they trigger a revolt. And that's why, for those of you who block the pipelines and do everything that you should be doing, you can't despair. Because there will come a moment when you're not alone. When the fear, the conformity, the passivity melts away. I saw it in the Stasi state, which until the creation of the current security and surveillance global apparatus was the most effective police state in human history. And a group of Lutherans in Leipzig would march in candlelit vigils to protest the regime, not very many, week after week after week, and then suddenly, by September of 1989, 70,000 people were in the streets of Leipzig. And Erich Honecker, the dictator who'd been in power for 19 years, sent down an elite paratroop division to fire on the crowd. And the paratroopers refused to do it, and Honecker was out of power within a week.
Wonderful, yeah.
All right.
As someone who spent a lot of time in Muslim countries, I'd be interested in your thoughts about what I find a very worrying amount of rhetoric in your country, and we're starting to see in this country with the current government we have, of this anti-Muslim rhetoric, scapegoating, if you will, of Muslims. And I find this a very worrying trend, and I just wonder what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, it's terrifying because it's a complete refusal to grasp what we've done over the last 12 or 13 years. I mean, why did ISIS burn the Jordanian pilot in a cage? Because we have been dropping 1,000-pound iron fragmentation bombs, burning all sorts of people alive in their houses. We have beheaded far more people, including children, through our militarized drones and our airstrikes than ISIS has ever beheaded. And the inability to understand our own culpability for creating this rage, and the false belief that the violence that caused it is the remedy, is part of our collective insanity. And I spent 7 years in the Middle East. I was the Middle East bureau chief for the New York Times, and I'm with you. I'm terrified at the way, I just went and watched that awful movie, American Sniper, but it is really, at its core, fascist. And it is about the dehumanization of Muslims and the right to murder, including women and children. And that incredible historical amnesia, that lack of consciousness about what we've done, the hundreds of thousands of innocents who are dead. And, this corporatized media has done a very good job of presenting this kind of mythical false narrative about who we are and our supposed virtues. And so yeah, I'm as frightened as you are. And it is there. Every war I ever covered, you first get people to speak about other groups as if they're not human. And then you exterminate them. It's always preceded by that kind of rhetoric. Great.
Hi, Chris. Given your call for resistance and revolt, has your position on issues like property destruction and more diverse methods of resistance changed recently?
No. It's a terrible quandary, because when Joe Sacco and I did the book Days of Destruction, Days of Revolt, one of the chapters is out of southern West Virginia, where they are using 25-story drag lines to rip the tops off Appalachian Mountains and turn the entire area into a toxic waste dump. And I think it's clear, because in that kind of sacrifice zone, everybody's bought off. The press is bought off, the politicians are bought off, big coals, even like writing the textbooks. And you're seeing it here with these pipelines, with coming into the schools and indoctrinating them. And I think a lot of the activists felt correctly that the only way to stop the drag lines was to blow them up. And I think they're probably right. On the other hand, the security and surveillance state has so heavily infiltrated movements that the person who's probably egging you on to blow it up is an informant, and you will spend the rest of your life in prison. And that is a quandary. So I don't know how we're going to stop these pipelines. We have to stop them. It's clear that the demands of the citizenry, not to mention the demands of the planet, are utterly irrelevant to global capitalists. And I accept that that's a difficult argument. But we have seen, for instance, in the United States, and I haven't studied Canada, but all of the Muslims who've been caught up since 9/11 in terrorism charges, 95+% have been framed. They've been set up. And as somebody who covered the US government and knows its resources, I think sometimes activists are not always aware of how heavily monitored and infiltrated we are and the kinds of resources that we have. And that's why I have not stood for property destruction, why I have always stood with transparency. And I'm not a pacifist. I was in Sarajevo during the war. We knew that if the Serbs broke through those trench lines, a third of the city would be murdered, and the rest would be driven into displacement and refugee camps, because that's what happened in Vukovar and the Drina Valley. So I understand that there are moments when forces intent upon your annihilation, which these corporate forces are, require armed resistance. But I just don't think that internally it's going to work. And I'm gambling that we can build a nonviolent movement. I may be wrong, but I'm gambling that that is the most, because I think that, just as I saw in East Germany, the best mechanism is to try and create divisions within the power structure so that they become paralyzed, so that we can draw civil servants, even police, over to our side. Just a small story. I was arrested in front of the White House with 133 veterans protesting the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and as we were being cuffed, it turns out most of the Washington, D.C. police were in the National Guard and had been in Iraq and Afghanistan, and as they cuffed us, they would say, "Keep protesting these wars." That's what I'm hoping for, but I'm not naive enough to tell you it's going to work. I'm gambling that I hope it will.
Questions back here.
Hello, good night. Thank you for standing up and speaking up. You say the only thing we have left is to put our bodies on the street, but you have put yourself up with your suit against the Obama administration, and I would like an update on that, and also I want to thank you for that.
Yes, she's referring to a court case called Hedges versus Obama, where I sued the president in federal court over Section 1021 of the National Defense Authorization Act, which overturns over 150 years of domestic law and permits the military to seize U.S. citizens on American soil that substantially support, that's not a legal term, that's not material support, Al-Qaeda, the Taliban, or something called associated forces, again a nebulous term, hold them in military facilities, including in our black sites overseas, and strip them of due process and keep them there indefinitely. And we won in federal court. And then every national security lawyer in the government descended on the appellate court, the Second Circuit, which was above. It was kind of a fascinating moment because the judge issued a temporary injunction, meaning that the law was no longer in effect. And so the national security lawyers arrived at her chambers the day she issued the ruling, that was on a Friday, and demanded that the law be put back into effect for national security, of course. And she refused, to her credit. And so at 9 a.m. on Monday morning, they went to the higher court, the appellate court, which is right below the Supreme Court, and demanded the same thing. And unfortunately, this appellate court agreed. And the lawyers and I couldn't figure, we knew they'd appeal, but we couldn't understand why the Obama administration was so aggressive, and I think we came to the conclusion that it was because they're already using the law, that in part of our black sites in places like Bagram are probably holding dual Pakistani-U.S. nationals. And if those people ever got out, they could charge the government with contempt of court. And what they did legally, and this is probably not unfamiliar within your own legal system, is the courts were in a kind of quandary because it's clearly unconstitutional to strip a citizen of due process and use the military to carry out, in essence, extraordinary rendition on the streets of American cities. And so the appellate court took months to rule. And what they did is waited. I was also a plaintiff in a Supreme Court case called Clapper versus Amnesty International, where we had challenged the government's wholesale security surveillance. Now, this was before the Snowden revelations, and the government got up in court and said that our fear that we were being monitored was speculation. And not only that, they told the Supreme Court that if we were being monitored, the government would tell us. Which, of course, we now know is a lie. So the Second Circuit waited for that ruling. And the way they went for the exit door is to say, well, Hedges doesn't have standing in Clapper versus Amnesty, therefore he doesn't have standing in Hedges versus Obama, and they threw it out, and it is now law.
I believe we are at our last question back here somewhere.
Could you give your perspective on what has gone on in Ukraine and what is going on in Ukraine as of now?
That's not an area of the world I know well. And I've not reported from it. The only thing I can say is the heavy expansion of NATO is a huge mistake. And it's like, poking a stick in Putin's eye, which is not a good idea. But what's happening internally, the fact that there probably are Russian forces, it's kind of a mess. Let's take another question, because Ukraine's not really something I think I have a lot of.
I can't see the people with microphones. I'm like pointing at nothing. I see the hands, I just don't see the microphones. Okay, great.
Hooray.
Sorry.
So we're all obviously great admirers of your intellect, and I think the thing that goes unsaid is that you are facing far more information than I face, and facing that truth eye to eye. And I'm just, this is a very personal question, but how do you do that? What are the tools that you call on to be able to face this truth and to be able to face it again and again every single day?
Well, I mean, it's how you manage with despair, which is real. And for me, it's about always having a personal relationship with the oppressed. So all of my career as a foreign correspondent was spent in the developing world, but not only in the developing world, but in places like Sarajevo, El Salvador, and Gaza. And this is what we did when we wrote Days of Destruction, Days of Revolt. It was 2 years with the poorest of the poor, literally, in the United States. And it's why I teach in a prison. Because the moment the oppressed become an abstraction, then I think you can succumb to despair. But when the oppressed have a face, but more importantly, when you love them. I mean, every time when I walk out that prison door, I can't betray them. And you would think it's depressing. I taught in a Supermax, I taught Shakespeare, probably not their idea of a fun summer, but I taught Shakespeare a lot, and I taught a drama course in a maximum security. I teach in a maximum security prison. And so we read August Wilson, and as an experiment, I said, okay, instead of writing papers, I'm going to have you write scenes from your own life every week. And I had attracted 4 or 5 of probably the best writers in the prison. And so I would take home that first week those 28 scenes, 28 students, with that kind of musty smell that prison always has on the paper. And I'm reading through it, and I hit one that's like amazing. And then I hit another one that's amazing. And after a few weeks, I say, maybe we can write a play. So I'm supposed to be writing my book, which will be out in May. I didn't tell my publisher, hoping I would get an extension. And I dropped it. And I added another night every week. And I spent 4 months forming this play, which was completely autobiographical. And the stories are heartbreaking. So I remember one class I said, I want you to just think of a moment when you're sitting with your mother, and just write me a dialogue with you and your mom. And at the end of the class, one of the students comes up and says, well, what if we're a product of rape? And I said, well, Timmy, that's what you got to write. And that's what he wrote. And it was a story he'd never told. And the story is this. He's in a car in Newark, and he's stopped with his half-brother. And the cops find a gun. And the gun belongs to his half-brother. And if nobody takes possession of the weapon, they're all charged. And he says to the cop, it's mine. And the scene he wrote is sitting in the jail, calling his mother, saying, it doesn't matter, Mom. I was never supposed to be here anyway. You have the child you love. And when he got up and read this, and we couldn't read it we couldn't perform it in the prison because it's incendiary. I brought in Cornel West and James Cone, who I quoted tonight, who I admire immensely, as my audience. And when they finished reading, I looked around and said, "Where's Timmy?" And they said, "He's in the men's room." And I went down and found him, and I look like a munchkin next to all these guys because all they do is lift weights. And he's, seated in a corner, shaking and weeping. And we had read August Wilson's great play, Joe Turner, Come and Gone, which is set in a boarding house in Pittsburgh in 1910 in the aftermath of slavery, when broken African-American families are trying to reconstitute their families. And there's a conjurer in the play named Joe Loomis who keeps telling them that these people will not be whole until they find their song. And on the last class, I had that play. And before all my students left, they signed the front page. And I said, "This is your song." And I said, "I don't know anything about producing a play, but when I walk out of these prison walls, I'm going to take it to every director in New York. And in January, it'll be produced in New York." And when I went back into that prison and told them, the words everyone said was, "Can our families go?" And I said, "I don't know how I'm going to do it, but I'm going to have a bus in Newark on opening night, and all your families are going to be there." And I didn't solve the problem of mass incarceration. I didn't overcome evil. But it is that act of the human imagination. It is the capacity to make their song heard that makes resistance glorious. And that's how I keep going.
Okay. We have 1,200 wonderful souls in this room tonight, and we can feel the love up here on this stage. And I think we have 1,200 mobilized resistors. So thank you so much, Chris. Thank you so much.